So, anybody who is a direct descendant of Elizabeth Osborn Clay, please stand up. Wow, I thought there'd be more than that. Okay, then everybody that is related through marriage, Dean, don't sit down. Your wife has to stand up. Anybody who's married, related through one marriage, not too many more. How about anybody that's related through any number of marriages? Okay. I'm going to include myself in that bunch, and I didn't even know it until recently. And I'll show you at the end of my talk. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of start at the beginning of her life. She was born in what is now Germany. At the time, it was just a collective of Confederate states, if you want to call them that, it didn't become Germany till later. And they were having a pretty hard time with economic hardships, food crisis, a lot of unemployment. And in 1848, they had an actual revolution, but it failed. And in the 1860s, they had 3 little wars, and there was a lot of bad stuff going on in that part of the world, and which is probably one reason Elizabeth emigrated to the U.S., but she was also raised by a stepmother who she didn't like. In 1863, Elizabeth, who was about 18, and her younger sister, who was about 16, set sail for America on a sailing ship. Took them 49 days to get across the Atlantic Ocean to Boston. They didn't stay there long. They almost immediately set out around the Horn to San Francisco. And that took anywhere between 4 and 6 months. So they spent most of a year. They set out in the spring of 1863, and it was interesting. They hit Boston right at the height of the Civil War. Gettysburg was the first few days of July of '63, and there were beginning to get ship blockades along the eastern coast. So there was a little bit of threat as far as ships going south around the Horn from Confederate ships, but not really that much. So they landed in San Francisco the fall of 1863 and stayed with their older sister Mary, who had gone there I don't know how long before, but they had cashed in on the gold rush by selling mining supplies, and they got fairly wealthy. They decided to move back to Germany, and Elizabeth and Anna went up the coast, probably by ship, to Portland, and then on up the Columbia River to Lewiston in 1865. So they stayed there in San Francisco for a couple of years. Just a map to show you the Columbia River, Snake River, Lewiston. They're going to be going down this way before too long. They got to Lewiston. This picture was taken in 1863, so it looked a little different by 65. Things were changing rapidly. This was it was kind of after the first flush of the gold rush. The rush to Florence was over. At first, Lewiston was a tent town. It was almost entirely tents. You can see a few tents there. By 1865, a couple of years after this was taken, there were probably fewer tents. Elizabeth, at least, I don't know if Anna was with her, and this may come as a surprise because in a biography that Minnie Clay Dryden wrote, she made it pretty clear that Anna and Elizabeth took saddle horses and went to Warren. And I'll show you why I doubt that in a minute. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but it was over 100 miles, and when I say 100 miles, it was probably by, as the crow flies, from Lewiston to Warren. Warren was in the middle of nowhere. There were no roads. There weren't even wagon roads between Lewiston and Mount Idaho. If you don't know where Mount Idaho was, it was just south of present-day Grangeville. And it was a bigger town to start with until Grangeville formed around a Grange Hall, which is why they called it Grangeville. So it took 2 or 3 days just to go from Mount Idaho to Florence, and I'm not sure what route they would have taken. I know some things about the wire bridge that was built the next year after their journey. So they probably took the Elkhorn Ferry about 2 miles upstream from present-day Riggins. The reason I mentioned the wire bridge is because it's right here. I just included this picture, aside from showing the wire bridge, to show you what kind of mountains they had to go through on those Salmon River breaks. Riggins is quite a ways downstream, so if they took that ferry, it would have been down in here. But they still had to go up through these mountains. Warren was way over here, way up in the middle of nowhere. And the next year after they came through here, this bridge, this is just a zoomed in picture of that last picture. I took both of these on a hike up there. If you want some exercise, try that. This is now called the Wind River Bridge, and this is the bridge that's there now. It was built in the 60s by the Forest Service. In 1867, they called it the Wire Bridge because they packed in individual wires and spun them, twisted them into cables to make a bridge about this same place. And it became the main pack trail between Florence and Warren for quite a few years before there were any roads. It came down, I'm not sure exactly, I've hiked it, and it's a twisty, steep trail. So anyway, just kind of shows you what kind of mountains they had to deal with. And for a woman, or even two women together, to make that kind of journey, they must have been pretty gutsy, you know, out there in the middle of nowhere. So in Warren, women were very popular because they were pretty rare, and she met Warren Osborn, and they were married on October 23rd, 1868. She'd been there a year or two. William Osborn is an interesting character. His ancestors came to America on the Mayflower, which of course is a big deal. His older brother, a couple years older, Samuel Osborn Jr., their father was named Samuel. He eventually ran the biggest, or one of the biggest, whaling operations in the U.S. He had 8 sailing ships, fully crewed, and became quite wealthy. And even today, Osborn Wharf at Edgertown, where William was born, is a well-known place on Martha's Vineyard. And there's several buildings there as well related to the Osborn family. So people know who the Osborns were and are on Martha's Vineyard. William and his younger brother James went to California. They undoubtedly went around the Horn, and it wouldn't surprise me if they traveled on one of their brother's whaling ships. It would kind of surprise me if they didn't, actually. So they went there for the gold rush, about 1849. They evidently didn't get rich. James died or was killed. I don't know which, but he didn't survive that time period. And William, after the gold rush kind of faded, went on to Warren. When they got married, William was 43 and she was 23. So there were 20 years difference between them. And while they were at Warren, they had 4 kids. William Jr. was the oldest, and I'm going to call him Willie, and the reason for that is on one of the early census forms, they wrote Willie for his name. I don't know if that was just a childhood name or not, but it's a handy way instead of saying William Jr. every time. So these other kids, Caroline, Edward, and Annie, were born on these years, all born while they were at Warren. And in 1874, they moved down to the Salmon River. And this picture, I'm guessing, was around 1874, probably just before they moved. I'm not positive. I'm going by the age of the kids. But where's Willie? I have no reason why he isn't in this picture. Anna Klein, the sister of Elizabeth. Now, this is where it gets interesting because I found one place online that said she married Harry Mason on November 9th, 1867. They were supposed to have gone to Warren in 1866. So she either went to Warren and came back, maybe met Harry there, or maybe she never went to Warren. I don't know. There are at least 4 different versions of this era of their lives, especially the Nez Perce War, the murders that happened before the war. Some of them vary quite a bit, so memory is a funny thing. People don't always remember things exactly. The 1870 census is a pretty good indicator of what really was going on in 1870. At the Nez Perce Reservation at Lapwai, these people lived there. And it was kind of a mystery at first because it said all these people were named Mason. Harry seemed to be the head of the household. He was 39 and he was a hotel keeper. Then there was Thomas, who said he was 28, and then Anna, Harry's wife, and these people. Turns out this age was wrong. He was actually 43. He was Harry's older brother. This was Tom's wife and their kids. So I don't know if Harry and Anna ever had kids. I couldn't find out that they did. If anybody knows, let me know. But anyway, that's where Anna wound up after their big trip over across the ocean and everything. She will show up later. Helen Mason was Harry and Tom's sister. And sorry, this gets a little complicated, and that's why you might want to get a copy of the family tree. Helen Mason Walsh, their sister, wrote an account of the murders before the Nez Perce War, and she wrote a pretty detailed account, and I'm going to quote her quite a bit here. This is Anna. I happened to find this. Anybody ever seen this picture? I just stumbled onto it on familysearch.org. And so this is Anna, Elizabeth's little sister, and Harry Mason. So at some point, they moved to Salmon River. Harry Mason also had a whaling background. I don't know exactly where he was from, but he actually went to the San Francisco or California area anyway on a whaling ship. I'm not sure what his connections were. And it turns out, according to Helen Walsh's story, the reason he was an innkeeper or a hotel keeper was it was actually a stage station. And he and Tom were running that on the Lapway Reservation on the stage road between Lewiston and Mount Idaho. The locality is now known as Mason Prairie and is near a creek called Mason Creek. That's what Helen Walsh said. I have no idea if that's really true or not, but who am I to say? So, while Elizabeth and Warren were living at, Elizabeth Osborn were living at Warren, William was carrying mail between Warren and Indian Valley. That seemed to be a really popular job. And they had X number of milk cows. I don't know how many they had, but they had enough milk that they were churning butter in a 50-gallon churn powered by a water wheel. Now that's a major butter production. And can you imagine milking even 3 or 4 cows twice a day? And she would continue this. You'll see, even after she moved to Meadows Valley, she kept milking cows and selling butter. So in 1874, they moved from Warren to French Bar on the Salmon River. It was just south of Whitebird a few miles. And in one newspaper account, I saw it called French Settlement. And the reason might be because in the years previous to this, before the gold rushes, French trappers, Canadian trappers, were pretty common in the Northwest. And when trapping kind of waned a little bit, they probably started looking for gold. That's probably how some of them wound up around the Whitebird area. And there are several French people that are in this story as we go along. So as they moved from Warren, it was 100 miles as the crow flies from Warren down to the Salmon River where they lived. And they took the youngest kids in pack boxes. These little kids, this is about how old they were. I hope they had a pretty calm horse. I've seen pack horses buck off a trail that you wouldn't want kids in a pack box. Again, Willie's not there. I don't know why. This is just a map showing this is the Osborn place. This is where they settled. This is where Harry Mason and Anna lived. And most of these other names, if you read about the murders in the opening days of the Nez Perce War, almost every one of these will show up. William had a gold claim, or probably panned gold in the river, and Elizabeth during that time learned to read English. In case I forget to mention it, she had a heavy German accent her whole life. So Elizabeth's sister, Anna, was married to Harry Mason. She died in 1876. Don't know why. She's buried there at Whitebird in the same cemetery where some other people are buried that you'll see here in a minute. And Harry's sister, Helen Mason Walsh, moved there with her 2 little kids. Her husband hadn't arrived yet, and he wouldn't arrive until after the violence, if he arrived at all. He wasn't there when the story happened that you're going to hear in a minute. Helen, in her memoir, said the Osborn family lived at the placer mine, where he and his two partners, Bill George and a Frenchman, had cabins. Their mine and cabins were located less than a mile up the river from Harry Mason's store, her brother's store. So again, here's the Osborn place, here's the Mason store. So in 1878, I got a detour just a little bit here because there's a side story that really has a lot to do with this. The government had been trying to put the Nez Perce Indians on a smaller reservation for about 10 years. I think there were 5 bands of Nez Perce, and the Wallowa band, their headquarters was over around Joseph, Oregon, Wallowa Lake in that area, their home territory. They did not want to leave. None of them wanted to leave. But they were the last holdouts. They called them the non-treaty band of the Nez Perce. And finally in 1877, the government got serious and gave them a deadline. I think it was like the end of June or something, to move their whole outfit, their horse herds, or everything they had into the reservation, or they would pay the consequences, whatever that was. And so in June of 77, they made the big move. They crossed the Snake River. It was really running high. They had a big horse herd they had to take across the river. It was really not a good idea, but they felt like they had no choice. They made a big camp west of Camas Prairie on the breaks of the Snake River. I think it's called Rock Creek, where they had a campground there. And Chief Joseph, of course, was the best known of that band. And he gets a lot of credit during the Nez Perce War for being the Red Napoleon and all that garbage. He wasn't a war chief. He was in charge of women and children, and making sure people were fed and things like that. The only reason he became famous is after the war, when they surrendered, he was about the only chief that was left, the only leader. So he got to surrender. But that's another story here. So June 13th, a bunch of young warriors at this camp up west of Camas Prairie worked themselves up thinking about the murders that whites had gotten away with over the years, and insults and cheating. When they'd go in a store, they'd charge them twice as much as the prices really were, things like that. And there was a lot of animosity. So I think it was like somewhere between 3 and 5 young warriors went down along the Salmon River and started killing people. By the time they were done, there were about 16 people killed. But they started on the 13th. The first guy they killed was Mr. Devine down here. Then they went to the Elfers place. This is the Elfers Ranch. This was taken after the Nez Perce War. But look at how steep that country is. I don't know. The Indians would go up and down that river like it was nothing. This is another picture of the Salmon River. I don't know where it was taken. I don't know who this is. I couldn't figure out what that said or why the picture was taken. This is from the Krigbaum collection. Anyway, it kind of shows the country and a little bit of the settlement. Again, Helen Walsh, they heard that the Indians were killing people, so James Baker, who lived nearby, said, "Come to my place. It's better defended than your other places, and we'll have a better chance." So Harry Mason, his sister Helen Walsh, and her 2 little kids, the Osborn family and Bill George, started out for Baker's place, about 4 miles from the Osborn place. I corrected most of the spellings, but she spelled it like this, spelled Osborn. The older Osborn children rode a horse. Mrs. Osborn preferred to walk with her husband. That would be Elizabeth. And along the way, they were suddenly confronted by 18 or 20 mounted Nez Perce. Those young guys that came down at first went back to the camp, started bragging about how many people they'd killed and what they'd done, and a bunch of other young guys got all hot under the collar, and they came down. So there were quite a few of them, and they were hell-bent on killing people. So they ran into these 20 or so Indians that were mounted on horses as they were trying to get to the Baker place. And I'll just read this. Some of them called out in Chinook, the old Hudson Bay trade language, for the women and children to come over where they were. They would not shoot. I did not understand what they said, but Mrs. Osborn, that would be Elizabeth, did. Screaming, she picked up one of her children and pushed another one before her to the fence. Frantically tearing off some of the pickets, she pushed the children through into the orchard and quickly followed them. Osborn followed her with the rest of the children into the tall grass of the orchard, and that's when the Indians started shooting. They hit one guy in the thumb. It hurt like hell, and he suffered quite a bit with that, but that was the least of their worries later. This is a dark story here. Each family had some dogs, and they threw rocks at the dogs to get them to go back, not follow them, because the dogs would be whining and barking and growling at things. And so William Osborn told Harry, if you kill this dog, I'll hold him for you. And so he held it while Harry cut his throat with a pocket knife. And the children took it without a murmur, as they took everything during the whole fearful ordeal through which we passed. Several times, almost every memoir mentions how quiet the kids were. It was like they were in shock. At one point, they did cry because they were hungry, but it's interesting that every memoir mentions how quiet the kids were. So they reached Mason's store. He had a store and probably a house too. And here was the dog coming along behind him that they thought they'd killed. And the way she put it, he dragged himself after us all night, keeping out of sight. That's terrible. And when they got to the Mason place, the house and the store had been ransacked. All the food was taken. The kids were hungry and tired, and they started crying and making a fuss. And so this is where they made a fatal mistake. They decided to go back to the Osborn place. If they just stayed there, there wasn't any food, but if they'd hid out there where the Indians had already taken everything, several people probably would have lived. So just as they got back to the Osborn place, the Indians attacked. They got there about the same time. They were able to get in the house. There were 3 men, 2 women, and 6 children all crowded into a 2-room cabin. The reason there were 3 men, there was Harry Mason, William Osborn, and a Frenchman that they encountered along the way. Harry had a brand new, I think it was a Winchester repeating rifle that he was really proud of, and the Indians wanted it really badly. So Harry stuck the Winchester out between the logs of the cabin, and Mrs. Osborn cried, "Don't shoot, they are friends of ours, perhaps we can pacify them." Mr. Osborn, turning from the door, cried, "For God's sake, don't shoot, Harry." And Helen says, "My brother hesitated. Then bullets came crashing through the window. A second volley struck every man. The Frenchman never moved but once after he fell. Mr. Osborn sprang up again and tried to raise his rifle, shouting, 'You devils, you,' and then fell back dead." That's one version. Elizabeth said in a 1911, years later, quote, she said, she felt like we might as well die together, believing it was their last moment on earth. In telling the story, Mrs. Osborn said the bullets were so thick they seemed like snow. I don't know, it seemed to be a log house. How the bullets came through the walls, I don't know, but maybe just through the window. Minnie Clay Dryden, which was Elizabeth's youngest daughter, wrote an account in 1940, and she said, "William started to shoot at the Indians through a broken window, and a bullet came through the window and pierced his heart. And the only thing he was able to say was, 'My God, why did I ever bring you here?' The children were all hid under the bed. After the men were all killed, Chief Mox, somewhere else it says it was Chief Whitebird, who knew Mrs. Osborn, told her and the other women to take the children and go to Slate Creek Stockade. The women dragged the men's bodies out into the yard and covered them with blankets." Another account said the Indians drug them out there. Helen said, "A blazing bundle of old rags was thrust through the window and fell on the floor." This was before they broke into the house. And Mrs. Osborn and the children were all lying very quietly under the bed, and she could see the Indians walking around. And Helen's young baby made a noise and gave them away where they were hidden. They probably would have found them anyway. And the Indians threw the burning rags back out through the window. There's a little, I'm kind of shortcutting this story. There's a lot of details, and different versions are interesting, but they came out from under the bed when they told them to, and Mrs. Osborn, Elizabeth, replied, "No, we will not come out. You will kill our papooses." And one of the Indians said, "No, no kill papooses, no clutchmen, No white-haired man. In other words, they weren't going to kill old people or kids or women. We came out, this is Helen writing, we came out, Mrs. Osborn first. The sight of her husband lying dead at her feet seemed to madden her and fill her with a fierce courage. She commenced to berate the Indians. Look there, she cried, pointing to the body. Many is the dollar that he had toiled to earn and went for bread for your squaws and papooses. Now look at him. One of the Indians replied, oh, shut up. What's the matter with your mouth about that? Okay, here's what William Osborn looked like when he died, pretty much like that. Harry Mason was still alive. He was under the bed with the women. He was delirious, and they drug him out from under the bed and shot him, killed him. Helen said that the Indians drugged the men out and the women covered them with quilts. And she remarked that Mrs. Osborn felt like she should put on a black dress because her husband had died. I don't think any of these people were thinking very straight at the time. They were just really in shock. So they started out to Slate Creek. Slate Creek was 9 or 10 miles up the Salmon River. Helen said the children trudged the weary miles without complaint, though my little boy became completely exhausted and could only walk while Mrs. Osborn and I held his hand. He walked between us. Here's how old the Osborn kids were when this happened. Look at Annie was only 4 years old. I don't know how clear her memory would have been. Willie probably would have had a pretty good memory of what happened. Anyway, this is their ages. While they were heading out for Slate Creek, an old Frenchman named Shoemaker came along and joined them. He was trying to escape too. And he took Annie on his back and started for Slate Creek because he could walk faster than the women with the little kids. So he went ahead and promised he would send some men back to help the women. And at this point, the women were just exhausted and almost delirious and in shock. And an Indian woman that Elizabeth knew came along to help them, and Elizabeth sent Willie and Ed on the Indian's horse back to Slate Creek. I don't know why Carolyn was left behind. As I said, Carolyn was only 7. So the boys, they sent on the horse. And some men did come back from Slate Creek to get them. And by the time they got to Slate Creek, they were just, Helen said she didn't even remember a lot of stuff. She was basically almost unconscious and just in such deep shock and trauma that it was just crazy. Elizabeth wrote a story in the 1911 Meadows Eagle newspaper. And since hers is a first-hand account, you would tend to believe maybe hers was more accurate, but I am not completely sure. She said instead of Slate Creek, they went to Uncle John Wood's home 12 miles away from the Osborn cabin and stayed there 6 weeks. 12 miles would have been past Slate Creek, and everything else I've read said that the settlers went to a stockade at Slate Creek. And it was the Woods family that supposedly sent that Indian woman back with a horse to help carry the boys. So, once again, here's Osborn, Mason Place, Slate Creek. You probably recognize this if you go north on Highway 95. This is looking north. There's a Forest Service station here. There's a lot of homes back in here. Helen Walsh said a close guard was kept at night. This was at the fortress at Slate Creek. A close guard was kept at night while they were in the stockade, and the women and children sleeping in a stone cellar. Remember that cellar? That was within the enclosure. The stockade was between the creek and the nearby bluffs. Okay, there was a stone cellar, and it was between the creek and the nearby bluffs. This is a satellite picture. Here's Slate Creek. I don't know if these were the bluffs here. A. Spartan took some of us on a tour years ago and showed us where that cellar still was at the time. I seem to remember it as being right in this area, but my memory's kind of vague. If these are the bluffs and the fort was between the river and the bluffs, it would have been right in here somewhere. And I hope they're preserving that cellar. I don't know. It should be a historical monument of some kind. So 2 days after Osborn's and Harry Mason were killed, the cavalry finally arrived from Walla Walla and up by Lewiston, and the Nez Perce War began. This is where the battle happened, and I'll show you a little more detail later. If you go from, this is Highway 95. The old highway goes along up here and goes up the White Bird Grade. Here's where the battle happened, right in here. I didn't know this until fairly recently, but you can drive up here and there's a guided, basically there's a trail that goes clear around the battlefield and has, this is it, I'm going to go back, but see these interpretive signs, they have explanations of what happened, where it happened. Let's see what I say here. Okay, when the soldiers arrived, they came from way up here, they got up to the top of this ridge right here. They'd been riding all night, and the day before they hadn't had anything to eat. They were just beat. They were dead tired. The Nez Perce came out from behind, from where we are, came riding up in here, at least 4 or 5 of them with a white flag. And this idiot, he was a volunteer, just a settler. The first thing he did was he just up and shot one of the Indians' horses out from under him. What a, gee. Anyway, and a lot of people died because of that. The Indians had a white flag, they wanted to talk, and all hell broke loose after that. I mean, the Indians just went crazy. Not only were the cavalry guys exhausted, the first thing that happened was, along the way down this tiring trip, one of the trumpeters, one of the buglers lost his trumpet, didn't know where it was. The other bugler started to blow his first command. This is how they guided the troops, and he was shot before he even made a noise and killed. So they wound up without a bugler. So they had to shout commands. You can imagine how well you could hear somebody shouting over a bunch of guns going off, people yelling and stuff like that. So the Indians came charging up the hill here. They made a move around this way and came in from the side. This is a really steep bluff here and rocks on the top. And basically it was just a complete rout. 34 cavalry guys were killed eventually. Not one Indian was killed. They chased people up these draws, clear over into here all day and into the night. Soldiers were trying to hide out and they'd find them and just kill them. There was one settler woman with a small child who went up this hill too, made it all the way to Mount Idaho with this kid traveling all night. They found her. She was pretty well delirious. So as soon as the word got out, it was actually a mail carrier named Rybold who came to Indian Valley with the news of what had happened. And the people all the way from Council Valley to Boise just panicked. They were just scared to death. The rumor was that the Nez Perce were going to join the Umatillas and the Crows and every other tribe in the whole region and have what they called a general outbreak, where they'd all just gang up and start murdering people. So a couple of forts were built at Indian Valley area, on down toward Weiser. I think there was another fort. There was a fort at Emmett. They wrote to the governor. The mail carrier from Indian Valley to Boise took a message begging the governor for guns. It's surprising, you know, you watch Westerns and everybody has a gun and they're all macho guys and they got lots of ammunition, evidently, because they shoot like crazy. The settlers at Council, Indian Valley, in that area, they didn't have very many guns and they had very little ammunition. Same with the Salmon River people. They just didn't have that much firepower. So they shipped a bunch of guns up to the forts and people stayed in forts all summer. Meanwhile, you probably know at least some of the story of the Nez Perce were chased over the Rocky Mountains into Montana, and they finally surrendered in October, 40 miles from Canada, where they were trying to get away across the border. During their last night, there was a group that made it across the border, sneaked out during the night. But it was a terrible conflict. 120 to 150 Nez Perce men, women, and children died from one cause or another during that conflict for nothing. They wound up on the reservation anyway. So it's just a tragic story from start to end. So Harry Mason and William Osborn were buried in French cemetery. Remember, this was kind of a French area at first, it seemed like, so they called it French Cemetery. So here's the town of Whitebird. Here's where the battle happened. If you take this road down here from one way to the other, French Cemetery is right there. I'm going to zoom in. This sign basically explains that there are 14 total graves there in that cemetery. 3 of them are marked, and they happen to be William Osborn, Harry Mason, and Anna Klein Mason, Elizabeth's sister. Of course, she died before all this happened. I don't know why she died. There were 3 other of the settlers that were involved in this that were killed. I don't think the Nez Perce intentionally killed any women. I seem to remember there was one woman who never was found, and there's several theories of what happened to her, but nobody knows. And there are 8 people who just died in the area after that they used the cemetery. Zoomed in a little bit, this is where the cemetery is right there. It's a little enclosed area. You can't really see it. You can see that sign from the road, but you can't really see the cemetery. This is William Osborn's grave right here. This is looking south. The Salmon River's in the background. This is William's grave. This is Harry Mason's grave. This is Anna Klein Mason's grave. They didn't even put her first name on her tombstone. It was Mrs. Harry Mason. So that fall, I don't know where, maybe it was at the Woods place that she stayed until the fall. I don't know. Maybe she stayed at the Slate Creek, but Elizabeth went back to Warren, where she survived by washing clothes, and there are stories about what she did at Warren. Supposedly, all during her younger years, she weighed 85 pounds. And I was told that she and her descendants, immediate children, were pretty slender, small people. But 85 pounds, today's 11-year-old average is 84 to 87 pounds. The average woman in 1877 was 125 pounds. So if she weighed 85 pounds, she would have been really little. So while they were in Warren, there was no school there, but she got a man to give the kids some lessons. So Tom Clay was another mail carrier that she met at Warren. He had that same route between Indian Valley and Warren. And they agreed to get married, and the day they were to marry, he didn't show up. The next day he didn't show up. The next day he didn't show up. Finally, on the 3rd day, he showed up. And that I actually found out also happened during the Nez Perce War back in '77. He didn't show up for several days, and they were really worried that the Indians had killed him, but he finally showed up. So anyway, he was late to his wedding, but they did get married in February of '79. I think that's their wedding picture. If you see this chair in several pictures, it's because this is a studio prop in Grangeville where they had a lot of pictures taken. Now, this picture, I wish I could remember where I got it. This is supposed to be Tom Clay as a young man. To me, it does look like him, but if you don't want to believe it's him, fine. But that's the picture I came up with. I think this is about the time they were married. So they had their first daughter, Tom Clay and Elizabeth, in April 12th of 1880. So Elizabeth she was born in Warren in 1880. And that fall, in September, they moved to Meadows Valley. That's what I was trying to say. And they lived in Packer John Cabin. Hopefully it was in better shape than this. And one of the girls remembered the names of the delegates from the territorial convention that was held there was written on the window casing. Ironically, this picture from 1899 shows, it says, Uncle James Winkler and 2 Clay girls. So these are 2 of the Clay girls in later years, posing for a picture with the cabin they used to live in. This, I'm just guessing at the year range from the age of the kids. I'm theorizing he's somewhere around 14 to 16. So, and I don't know which one is Carolyn and which one is Annie. But this is probably something what they looked like when they lived in Packer John Cabin and when they came to Meadows Valley. They were pretty old by that time. In other words, they could probably do some household chores, chopping wood, stuff like that. Again, many Clay Drydens. Elizabeth's youngest daughter in 1940 wrote that memoir, and she said that the winters of 81 and 82 were really lonely because there were very few, if any, people that lived in the valley, and Tom was gone carrying mail a lot of the time. There were a bunch of wolves around, and bears were common. A wolf killed their dog. I'm kind of making a short version of this. If you want the full version, there are several that I can send to you. It was a hard winter, and a lot of the families just left. It was just too cold and miserable, and there were a few trappers that stuck around. However, Mrs. Rainey, in her book, The Valley I Remember, said the Campbell brothers came here in 1880, so they must have been here during this winter. So anyway, so in 1882, Tom and Elizabeth moved their family to a ranch that was later owned by their son Henry Clay, and this was their house in 1911. That house, the roads are different now, so it's hard to kind of orient. This is Clay Lane right here, and it goes over here, and their house was somewhere in here. This is in 1940. This is a Metzger map. They weren't terribly accurate, I've discovered, but it shows where the Clay property was in 1940. Notice they called her Kate. She was also called Katie. This is Henry Clay and Kate. The house was right in here somewhere. Later, I remember Dick and Marjorie Clay lived over a little bit closer to Clay Lane here. But anyway, this house, that house is where what I'm talking about, that they moved into right in that area. Packer John's cabin. No, this is Morris and Marla Krigbaum's house. This is the Krigbaum house. That's the nice older house on the highway that we'll show you in a minute. So in the fall of 1882, another family came along and had kids, and so the kids, the Clay kids and the Osborn kids, had somebody to play with, and they were kind of shy because they weren't used to being around people. Again, they were milking cows and selling butter at $1 a pound at Warren, which would be the equivalent of $35 a pound today. Pretty expensive butter, but they had to haul it a long way. Mary Clay, another Clay daughter, was born in 1885, and all during the 1880s, especially the mid-1880s on, the Meadows Valley really started being populated. A lot of people moved in. The first school was in 1884. There were enough kids there by then. Elizabeth became very well known as a nurse and a midwife. They called her Mother Clay. Again, she had a heavy German accent, which must have been kind of interesting. But she, in times of sickness or in childbirth, she was somebody that people depended on all over the valley. So in 1887, Henry Clay was born, another son. In 1888, there was an epidemic of diphtheria, and I'm sure Elizabeth was involved in caring for people then. Carolyn Osborn married Charles Campbell in 1888. So, of course, by this time, the kids, a lot of them were pretty well grown. So this is just a picture of Minnie and Lizzie Clay, sisters. She's quite a bit older than Minnie. So Minnie was born, this is the next Clay child born in 1889. And then in May of 1889, Albert was born to Carolyn and Charles Campbell. This, of course, is a later picture of him. He's not a baby there, but he's a young guy. So in March of 1891, Carrie was born to Carolyn and Charles Campbell. And then in 1893, Anna was born to Carolyn and Charles Campbell. They had a scat of kids in a real short time. Then Raleigh came along right away. This is just him as a young man. And then William Osborn Jr., swallowed a bunch of arsenic and killed himself at the age of 27. I don't think he ever married, didn't have any kids. I don't know. So in 1896, in February, Annie married Albie Ross Krigbaum. And here's where middle names come along. There are so many people in this family that don't use their actual first name, including you, Dean. Or should I say Marshall? Nobody called him Albie. His name was, they always referred to him as A.R. Krigbaum or Ross Krigbaum. So I'm going to be calling him Ross because in all the newspapers, that's all anybody called him. So he and Annie got married. The summer of 1896, the summer they were married, they found Tom dead in Goose Creek. The paper said, Thursday morning, the body of Thomas Clay was found in Goose Creek, where it was decided he had fallen while in a faint or was dead before he hit the water, struck the water. So that was the end of Tom Clay. Elizabeth and the older kids milked cows. I don't know how many cows they said. One place said they had a dozen cows, and that's a lot of cows to milk twice a day. And they sold butter locally. That's how they made a living. I suppose they had farmland too. November '89, Loyal was born to Carolyn and Charles. This is him as a young man. Then in 1902, Elizabeth Lizzie Clay married John Eston Freeman, another guy who was never called John. You'll never see his name except for J.E.S. Freeman or Eston Freeman. Everybody knew him as Eston. He was a stage guy, had a stage line, and I'll get into that a little bit later. This is just that 1940s Metzger map again, where it's showing where Eston Freeman had land. In 1907, Ed Osborn married May Tabor. This is the younger picture of Ed, but of course he was older than that when he got married, I hope. February 1909, Mary Clay was found dead in her bed. Her mother went to wake her up and she wasn't breathing. They said it was heart failure. I don't know that they ever did an autopsy or anything, but she was only 24 years old. So in 1911, Adams County was formed from Washington County, and that same year, the Pacific and Idaho Northern Railroad reaches New Meadows. And in 1912, there was an election to figure out what town was going to be the county seat of Adams County, and New Meadows, Fruitvale, and Council were really competing with each other, and obviously Council won out. In 1912, Elizabeth started feeling sick, and it got worse and worse. Eventually, she was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and she died in August of 1912. She was so well known in this valley, plus her descendants alone would have made quite a crowd. But Marla told me there was something like 100 wagons and other vehicles at the cemetery out here for her funeral. There were a lot of people that really liked her, really loved her. 1913 in January, Minnie Clary married Howard Dryden, another guy who never used his first name, evidently, right, Dean? Is this their wedding picture, you think? They look pretty young. And this is in their 50th wedding anniversary in 1963. So this is land. You still own any of this land, Dean? Yeah. No? Yeah. Oh, 1940. Minnie owned this piece. Howard, his name is on this, and this one, and this. So just to show you that. And then Henry Clay, married in 1913 to Catherine. Everybody called her Kate or Katie, evidently. And this is their 50th wedding anniversary, the picture that was in the paper in the Adams County Leader. This is just to kind of show you the family tree here. We're going to talk about Albert, Carolyn and Charles Campbell's kids. Oh, when I was a kid, everybody talked about Albert Camel. I thought it was spelled C-A-M-E-L. I swear to God, everybody in Meadows Valley Council, everybody called him Albert Camel. Maybe they still do. I don't know. I didn't know it was Campbell. Weird. Anyway, this is Dr. Thurston down at Council had a movie footage, a movie camera, one of the first in the country, and he came up to the Circle C one spring, when they were branding and handling calves, and took a bunch of movie footage. And this is some pictures I got off of that movie footage. This is how I remember Albert. Probably a lot of you remember about that. He died 9 years after this. He wound up in the council nursing home, and some of you probably remember his big incident of hitting a horse on the highway out here, and that really took him down for a while. So Carolyn and Charles had a daughter named Carolyn. She married Robert Whiteman, who was a doctor. They had Anna and Donald and Bob Whiteman. I don't remember Bob this young. I knew him when he was a lot older. Okay, they had an Anna married Charles Organ. They had a daughter named Carol. And Carolyn and Charles' son Raleigh, I'm told, was married to Inez Wilson. I don't know how many people know that. He remarried, I don't know if it's pronounced Marguerite or Margaret. Marguerite? Okay. Their son Raleigh, First World War uniform. He was a state senator in the 60s. Here's from movie footage that Dr. Thurston took. This is from that same movie footage, all these. Evidently Charles Allen Campbell was known as Alan Campbell, because when they identified this picture, when I showed people this, they said, well, that's Alan Campbell. So here's Marguerite and Alan, her son David, who died in only not that many years ago, really. He has a little kid. His daughter, Linda, seen here at the council rodeo. And I hope you can forgive me for not including a lot of names in this family tree, because some of them I just didn't have. Some of them are still living, and I didn't know necessarily who they were. Dean and his wife wrote in some of the names in their line, and that's why I said on that family tree back there, if you want to add names to it, feel free. And I apologize for anybody I may have left off. I just had the resources I had. And Carolyn and Charles' next son was Loyal, and he married a lady named Mary. They had a daughter named Betty. These are young pictures of Loyal. And here's some pictures Dr. Thurston took. This is movie footage. He had an interesting chin. I never knew the man, but this is when they were shipping out cattle, loading them on the train. Ed Osborn, youngest kid, married May Tabor. They had these kids. Warren, down here, he lived at Indian Valley for a while. He had a daughter named Darlene. She married Raleigh Armacost, which was Bailey Armacost's son. So if you're an Armacost, you should have stood up a while ago. Just kind of a review of the line from Annie, married Ross Krigbaum. They had, the oldest son was Edlo. I'm told he was not super well liked. He kind of got on people's nerves, evidently, to a certain extent. He had these kids, including Alvin, who was called Corky. Their oldest daughter was named Zora. She married Philip Wood. And I'm told that, I think Marla told me, Edlo lived in that big house out there on the highway, and then Philip Wood and his wife lived there. And that house was sold just a few years ago. It's no longer in the Krigbaum family. Mary Krigbaum married Morris Brown. They had a son named Ross, a son named Herbert. And Carl Krigbaum, Annie and Ross's son, married a lady named Maud. He died when he was 27 years old in 1937. She remarried a guy named Herbert Kessel in 1944. But Carl and Maud had these two sons, including Morris, who is here, and Marla, his wife, are here. This little girl died a tragic death, and I'll get to that in a minute. William Osborn and Elizabeth, of course, their daughter Annie, married out Ross Krigbaum. Their son Edlo had these kids. Zora married Philip Wood, as I said. This is a picture of Annie when she was older. This is Ross when he was fairly young, actually. This is Zora looking like she's mad at her husband. I don't know what's going on there. This is an interesting picture because at this time Ross lived in Council Valley. Before he was 17, he lived down there. His parents moved in there in 1884. But apparently he knew the Osborn and Clay girls. He eventually married her, so they knew each other for a while. Ross Krigbaum was a real go-getter. He had a lot of irons in the fire. He was very ambitious. This item was from either a Weezer or, probably a Weezer paper. Ross Krigbaum of Meadows was in Weezer yesterday and reports that he went into Warren last week. This is in 1902 during the Thunder Mountain Gold Rush, by the way. With 8 horses and 2,600 pounds of freight, and had no difficulty in crossing Sesh Summit, the highest elevation on the Weezer Council of Warren route to Thunder Mountain. He had 1 horse of 1,000 pounds weight who hauled an 800-pound load with ease. The reason he was able to do that was because he was pulling a hide toboggan, and each horse was pulling a toboggan. It wasn't on their back, evidently. And this would have been in the winter, I assume. Krigbaum is the mail contractor to Warren and is thoroughly familiar with the entire country, having spent 30 years, man and boy, in that part of Idaho. And at some point, he was in partnership with a guy named Crowell, and they had a stage line. I think it went as far north as Grangeville. And the Freeman brothers bought that stage line, Eston Freeman and his brother. I'm assuming this is a Ross Krigbaum stage. Nobody seems to identify whether Ross is in this picture. I think that looks like him because in this next picture, this is him. He died in 1922, so this is probably not long before he died. This says stage office, Meadows, McCall, livery, transfer. I don't know if he was still in business at this time. But looking at that picture and this picture, this guy looks a little bit like Ross in his older years to me. This is looking southeast. The road originally went up through here to Long Valley. Ross was the first guy to build a road up Goose Creek and then up, I think it's Thorn Creek actually, that goes on up to Payette Lake. This is a stage, this is from a Statesman picture. When the rail line was built from Council toward New Meadows in 1906, it stopped at just south of Evergreen Park, and they had a round table there and stuff to turn around, and there was a hotel there, and Krigbaum, Ross ran a stage line from there to Meadows and probably on to McCall, or another stage company would have carried it from there. But here he is, I don't know if it's Ross driving or a hired driver, coming into Meadows in 1908, stage owned by Ross, coming from the Evergreen end of the line to Meadows. Of course, when the railroad reached New Meadows, that stage line was kind of put out of business. This is Ross's barn. You can't really see it very well. I have another picture of it. It's not a great picture either. So Ross was born in 1869, came to Council Valley with his parents in 1884, established a home. His father and mother, James Krigbaum, lived on Mill Creek, and Ross left home at 17 years old, came to Meadows and established a homestead out here east of Meadows, where their place is. Married Annie Osborn in 1896. He carried mail, built the first road up Goose Creek Canyon to Payette Lake, organized the telephone company, constructed the lines throughout the area, built the light and power plant system in Meadows Valley. He built a ditch and a pipeline and a generator that generated electricity out there by the Krigbaum place. He went to Weezer one day and came back feeling sick and died of the flu in March of 1922 at the age of 52. Here's a picture of the family when they were young, when everybody was young. Ross, Annie, Edlo, Zora, and Mary. This house probably looks familiar. This house, when Ross first came up here and established his homestead, he lived in a cabin way back against the hill over here. And then they built this house in 1906. Here's what it looks like today, pretty much the same. And like I say, this is no longer in the Krigbaum family from as of just a few years ago. Annie and Ross had another daughter named Mary. This little girl here died at age 7. And here's the newspaper article. Her dress caught on fire when a kid was playing with matches or something, and instead of dropping and rolling, she started running, is what I gather. And she survived for a little while, but she died. Getting back to Carl, he had 2 sons, Lemoyne and Morris. As I said, Morris and Marla are here. I didn't put their children on here. This is Carl and Maud, Morris's parents, and that's Morris, that's Lemoyne. Cute kids. Carl died really young. It's a shame. He's 27 years old. And of course, Maud remarried, and we just interviewed Morris and did his life story, recorded it just a couple days ago. Here's Morris and Marla. Okay, the Clay line. After she remarried Tom Clay, they had a scad of kids and grandkids. As I said, Lizzie married Eston Freeman. They had a son named Roy. They had a daughter named Mary. She's the one that was found dead in her bed one morning. Henry Clay married Kate Levengood. They had a daughter named Margaret who married a Gordon. Tom Clay, Ed Clay, he had an interesting demise. Their son Jerry Clay, I'm going to show him later, and Frank and Albert, and Larry and Dick. I remember these guys. They died not that long ago in relative terms. And then Minnie, part of the same. See, everybody on this line is that generation. This is the next generation. This is the next generation. Indented it there. So, Tom Clay and Elizabeth, their daughter Lizzie, as I said, married John Eston Freeman. They had a son named Roy, and that's him. Eston Freeman had the Council Meadows stage line, and as I said before, he went to Thunder Mountain. He had the contract for mail between Meadows and Grangeville, so he was quite a stage man as well. Mary Clay, the one that died at 24. Ed Clay, in March 26 of 1956, Ed was 38 years old. The Circle C riders were taking cattle across Wild Horse River, right near the mouth where it enters the Snake River, which today is right below Brownlee Dam. A calf got, this is another story that memory may not be accurate, but this is the story I pieced together. A calf got caught in the current and was going down the river, and Ed plunged out into the river with his horse to try to get the calf. He was wearing a coat, chaps, and heavy winter clothes, and his horse went down under him. And the other riders saw him about 30 yards down the creek when he came up, and then he disappeared. He was missing until the middle of April when his brother Larry found him 10 miles down by Oxbow on the Oregon side. In his obituary, they said he was a well-known rodeo performer in the area. So here's this, Ed's son Jerry married Violet Woods. So if there's any Woodses here, you might should have stood up a while ago. There's a bunch of Woodses still around council. As I said, Kate and Henry Clay, their 50th wedding anniversary. Tommy Clay, now somebody told me this was probably Tommy. I'm not sure. If you recognize him, fine. If not, it might not be. But this is from Dr. Thurston's movie footage, and somebody thought that was Tommy. Here's Dick when he was a little guy. I just happened to have some of these pictures, so I thought I'd plug them in here. Marjorie Glenn, her sister, Georgiana Parker, was my neighbor most of my life, probably 70 years. She and Dick lived down at Fruitvale, and they were sisters. Just a few pictures of Minnie. And this is your grandmother? Yeah, this is when she was young, wedding picture, and then their 50th wedding anniversary. She's the one that wrote the memoir in 1940, the account of the beginning of the Nez Perce War and all those murders and stuff. Here they are again, wedding day and 50th anniversary. So many, some of their descendants, Marshall, Bill, probably not only called Bill, right? Never Marshall, you think? Yeah, no. Always Bill, never Marshall. Okay, some of their descendants. And here's Dean and Sandy, Marshall. I don't know what it is about middle names in this family, but. So here's some of their kids. What's that? Yeah, it was traditional, I guess. So here's the line from them, and it's all in that family tree back there. Okay, this is my last slide. If you go on familysearch.org, if you find somebody and then click on family tree, it'll tell you if you're related to these people. Here's William Osborn. We share a common ancestor just back a few. So he was my cousin. So I'm related to everybody who stood up in here. Okay, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. That's the last of it.